So, the most foundational book of the Bible is Genesis. Everything you need to know, you learned in kindergarten. Everything you need to know about God begins in Genesis. Genesis is where it all starts. So we can't even talk about Galatians until we start with some things in Genesis. And I go back to the first couple chapters of Genesis all the time. In fact, I want to take you there now. There's a verse here. It'll be on the screen, and it's also on your note sheet. Genesis chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. It says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And the Lord God commanded the man, 'You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die.'" One of the amazing things about the way the Bible starts is that it starts with God making everything good, and it starts with God giving people freedom. He says, you are free. Here's a whole garden for you. Eat anything in this garden. Go ahead, enjoy yourself. Have a blast. In fact, God says to the man, I'm going to give you a garden that's going to be great stuff. I'm going to give you a woman that's going to be great stuff. She's going to be naked and there's going to be no shame. That's going to be great stuff. God says, I'm going to bless you in every possible way. I'm going to give you total and complete freedom, and I'm going to give you one no. One no. Total and complete freedom, but here's a tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat from that tree. By the way, if you eat from that tree, you're going to die. Now just imagine the freedom here. If God told you, you can do anything in the world you want, but there's one thing if you do, it'll kill you. Can you imagine how much freedom you would have? I mean, you would do anything. You'd go, if that one thing wasn't skydiving, you'd go skydiving, because skydiving can't kill you. Right? If there was only one thing that would kill you, let's say that one thing was eating a piece of fruit that's sitting on the middle of your table. And God says, do anything else in the world. Do anything you want. Enjoy yourself. Anything you want. Just don't eat from that one tree. I mean, talk about incredible freedom. What we wouldn't be able to do to know the specific limits that God would say that one thing is going to get you. But everything else is fair game. Everything else is free. Just go and live. See, that's the way God designed it. And so He puts this tree in the middle of the garden. It's called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I think a lot of us, myself included, we have bought into the lie that the serpent tells to Eve in the middle of this story, where the serpent comes up to Eve and he says, but God is keeping it from you. God knows that when you eat from that tree, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And the serpent tells her, in order for you to know good and evil, you have to eat from that tree. You don't know good from evil right now. You need to eat from that tree. God is keeping something from you. We all have this tendency to say that when God says no, He's keeping it from us for Himself. It's something that God is being selfish over. It's something that God is keeping for Himself, not for us. He's keeping it for Himself, and you can't have it because God knows good and evil. And here's this tree, and the serpent says to Eve, God is keeping it from you. I think, on the other hand, and I'm just beginning to realize this, I'm beginning to realize that the simple fact the tree exists in the garden gives Adam and Eve the knowledge of good and evil. They didn't need to eat from it. The simple fact it exists. The whole reason God puts the tree there is so they would know there exists something outside of God's will. There exists something that is evil. The whole place is good. Everything here is good. Eat whatever you want, but I need to teach you a lesson. That in this world, there's some things that are bad. In this world, there's evil. In this world, there's something that's outside of God's plan for you. So God puts the tree there, and the fact that it exists is the knowledge of good and evil, because Adam and Eve can look at that tree and say, oh yeah, that's the thing that symbolizes evil. Everything else is good. The problem is we don't look at life the way God looks at life. God looks at life like He's given you freedom, and then there are pockets of evil that He asks you to avoid. But He's given you freedom all over. We look at life completely different. Picture in your mind this garden. Picture in your mind a tree. And picture in your mind a cage around that tree. And the cage is God saying, don't eat it. Don't eat from this tree. That cage is God's law, God's guidance. What you and I tend to do is we see the bars on the cage and we say, we're in jail. We see the bars on the cage and we say, I am in prison. God is keeping me away from something that could be good for me. God is keeping me away from something that would give me life. And so what we do is we think we're slaves to something God is telling us to do. We think we're slaves, and in response to that, we say, I need to find a way to exert my freedom. And so for Adam and Eve stepped through that cage, grabbed the fruit, ate the fruit, and then once they're inside that thing, they realize, okay, now we're in bondage. Now we're inside the cage. We do it all the time. You can think about the teenage kid. His mom and dad have been telling him things all his life. And now he finally realizes that he's bigger than his dad. He can beat his dad up, so he can actually do some things on his own if he wants to do those things on his own. Or maybe his dad's not in the picture, and the mom, he knows that he could take his mom, so he's not too worried. And so the mom says, I don't want you hanging out with that particular crowd of people. And the kid says, hey, listen, you know what? I can do whatever I want. I'm going to exert my independence and my freedom, and I'm going to hang out with whoever I want. And a couple months down the road, he realizes that group of friends wants him to do something that he doesn't want to do. But he's stuck. He's trapped. He's now in the club, and he doesn't know how to get out. The same kid, his mom tells him, now don't smoke, don't drink. And he says, listen, I'm going to exert my freedom. I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to exercise my independence, and I want to be free. And so he exercises his freedom by taking a drink, by beginning to smoke. And before long, he realizes that he's trapped in these things. As a 40-year-old man, he's going through 12-step programs to try to figure out how to get this thing licked. And he's struggled, and he's been captive to it for his whole life. It happens time and time again. We do things we think bring us freedom. And as soon as we've done them, we find ourselves behind bars. So I want to challenge you with a phrase here. We're going to begin a study through the book of Galatians to try to experience the kind of freedom God designed us to have. And it begins with this phrase. This is sort of an overall kind of phrase that I want you to put into your mind. It goes like this: as long as you think you need freedom, you will be a slave. See, God has already given you freedom. Especially if you're in Jesus, if you're with Jesus, if you've given Him your life, God has given you freedom, as we're going to see today. God gives it. It's not something you earn, not something you get, not something you walk into. It's something that's been given to you. God gives Adam and Eve freedom. They have the whole garden to themselves. Do whatever you want except for this one thing. They do that one thing and God says, okay, fine. Now you're going to be out in the wilderness of the rest of the world, and you can experience the kind of freedom you created for yourself, the real bondage to this pain and frustration. And there's one place you can't go, back into this garden. See, we view life as if we're limited, as if God is limiting us. When the truth of the matter is, God sets up boundaries so we can be free. This last winter, I was with my family down in Gatlinburg. Have any of you been to Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg? Okay, we went down there, and on our way to Gatlinburg, we drove past these go-kart tracks. You've seen these things probably if you've ever been there. There are tons of these go-kart tracks. And the first thing out of my son's mouth was, go-karts! Can we do go-karts? So on one of our last days there, we figured out we could do the go-kart thing, and we went there. And these go-karts go like 40 miles an hour. And and my son is 11, so we thought, this is awesome. They officially shouldn't have let him on the go-kart track driving a car by himself, but we were the first ones there that morning, and we talked the lady into it. And so we're out there, and we're driving these things around. And I tell you what, as we're driving around in the go-karts, we had so much fun, and it wasn't until last night I realized that there were walls all around that go-kart track. I was having fun. I was having a blast. I never for once felt like, you know what, I really need to get out of these walls. I really need to get out onto that road right out there. Never once did I say to myself, man, if only I could drive on the dirt with this thing, that would rock. Never once. But sometimes someone might whisper into my ear, listen, there's a whole road out there you could take that go-kart on, and then I'm going to start feeling limited. I got these walls around me. Listen, we do the same thing with God. He sets up his rules in a way that give us freedom, and yet we view them as legalistic restrictions that prevent us from living in freedom, and as a result, we become slaves. We're going to look at Galatians, but before we do that, what I want to do is I want to share with you the background of it. See, into the confusion of us thinking we're slaves when we're really free, and trying to be free and becoming slaves, into all this confusion comes the voice of a man who speaks a lesson so simple and so profound that it turns the world upside down. It's a message of the significance of Jesus' life. It's a message we call grace. It's a message that gives people freedom. And the first person to put this message into paper is the man Paul. And the first time he does it is in this book, Galatians. So let's talk about Paul. Just to give you a little bit of background about Paul and who he was. Paul was a Pharisee. You've read parts of the New Testament where Jesus talks about the Pharisees in a very negative sense. Paul was a Pharisee. The negative side of being a Pharisee means that he always focused on doing the law and only the law and never paid attention to the heart behind the law. But he knew the law of God backwards and forwards. He knew all 650 commands or however many there were. He knew them all backwards and forwards. He had the whole thing memorized. And he knew if you made a mistake, if you gave 9% of your money instead of 10% of your money, he'd want to knock on your door and say, listen, that's inappropriate. He knew everything you should be doing and could hold you to task. And so then when Jesus comes on the scene and he starts teaching these crazy things like God cares more about what's in your heart than what you actually do. And Jesus starts saying things against the Pharisees. Paul gets mad. He's like, this is wrong. And so Jesus gets killed, and Paul was probably part of the mix of people who were yelling, crucify him. And so Jesus gets killed, and then just a few days later, his disciples start talking about how they've seen him alive. And Paul thinks this is crazy because no one has ever come back to life, and he doesn't believe anyone ever will come back to life, and certainly not Jesus, the guy who didn't even teach the law properly. And so Paul is angry and he's mad. And you know what he does? He decides he's going to try to destroy this Jesus movement as soon as he can. And so he gets permission from the leadership of the religious leaders of Jerusalem. And he says, I'm going to try to destroy this thing. And he goes all over the countryside as far as he can go. And he tries to kill Christians. He participates when one Christian gets stoned to death. The guy's name is Stephen. And Paul is the one who gives approval to that particular execution. He's the guy. And so then one day he says, okay, I hear there's a group of Christians up north in Damascus. I'm going to go up